The sun-drenched streets of New Orleans buzzed with anticipation on what should have been the happiest day of Marcus Johnson's life. At 45 years old, the successful real estate developer was preparing to marry Camille Dubois, a stunning 32-year-old art gallery owner he had met just over a year ago. Their whirlwind romance had taken the city's social scene by storm, with many seeing it as a modern fairy tale. The handsome widower finding love again with a younger, vivacious woman who seemed to breathe new life into him after years of quiet grieving. The St. Louis Cathedral stood majestically against the clear blue sky, its spires reaching heavenward as if in blessing of the union about to take place within its hallowed walls. Tourists and locals alike paused to admire the beautiful flower arrangements adorning the entrance, whispers of excitement rippling through the crowd as they speculated about the high-profile wedding about to commence. Inside the cathedral, the atmosphere was a mix of nervous energy and joyful anticipation. Groomsmen adjusted their bow ties and smoothed down their tuxedos, while bridesmaids fussed over their elegant champagne-colored gowns. Marcus stood at the altar, looking dashing in his tailored black suit, a soft smile playing on his lips as he imagined Camille walking down the aisle towards him. But amidst all the excitement and romance, there was one person who felt anything but celebratory. 14-year-old Jamal Johnson, Marcus's son from his first marriage, sat in the front pew with a storm of emotions raging inside him. His deep brown eyes, so like his late mother's, were clouded with worry and fear. He fidgeted nervously with the cuffs of his suit jacket, his mind racing as he wrestled with the burden of knowledge that threatened to shatter his father's world. Jamal's thoughts drifted back to the day 6 months ago when Camille had first entered their lives. He remembered how she had charmed everyone with her megawatt smile and infectious laugh, how she had gone out of her way to befriend him and make him feel comfortable with her presence in their home. At first, Jamal had been wary. No one could replace his mother, after all, but Camille's warmth and genuine interest in his life had slowly won him over. Or so he had thought. As the weeks passed and Camille became a more permanent fixture in their lives, Jamal began to notice things that didn't quite add up. Small inconsistencies in her stories, furtive phone calls when she thought no one was listening, the way her smile sometimes didn't quite reach her eyes when she looked at his father. At first, he had dismissed his suspicions as paranoia, not wanting to jeopardize his father's newfound happiness. But then came the night that changed everything. It had been a typical Thursday evening. Marcus was working late at the office, leaving Jamal and Camille to have dinner alone. Jamal had been in his room, engrossed in a video game, when he heard Camille's voice floating up from the kitchen. Something about her tone made him pause the game and creep to the top of the stairs to listen. What he overheard in the next few minutes made his blood run cold. Camille was speaking to someone in hushed, urgent tones, discussing plans that made Jamal's head spin with their implications. Words like insurance policy, clean getaway, and no suspicion peppered the conversation. But it was the final exchange that seared itself into Jamal's memory. "Don't worry, baby. In a few months, Marcus Johnson will be out of the picture and we'll be set for life. Just stick to the plan." Jamal had retreated to his room in a daze, his mind reeling from what he had just discovered. Camille, the woman his father loved and trusted, was planning something terrible. Something that would destroy their family and potentially put his father's life in danger. In the weeks that followed, Jamal had become a silent observer, watching Camille's every move with newfound suspicion. He noticed how she subtly manipulated his father, pushing for a quick engagement and an even quicker wedding date. He saw the calculating gleam in her eyes when she thought no one was looking, the mask of affection slipping just enough to reveal the predator beneath. But what could he do? Who would believe the wild accusations of a teenager against a woman who had seemingly brought so much joy into their lives? Jamal had agonized over his options, torn between his loyalty to his father and his fear of destroying the man's happiness. He had considered confiding in his best friend, Tyler, or his guidance counselor at school, Mrs. Rodriguez. But each time he came close to revealing the truth, the words died in his throat. The stakes were too high, the consequences too dire if he was somehow mistaken. And so, Jamal had carried this terrible secret alone, watching helplessly as the wedding preparations moved forward at breakneck speed. He had tried to drop hints to his father, to create opportunities for Marcus to see Camille's true nature, but his efforts had been in vain. Marcus was too blinded by love to see the red flags that were so glaringly obvious to his son. Now, sitting in the cathedral as the wedding march began to play, Jamal felt the weight of his knowledge pressing down on him like a physical force. His palms were sweaty, his heart racing as he realized that this was his last chance to prevent a terrible mistake. But how? How could he stop this wedding without concrete proof? How could he make his father see the truth without destroying their relationship in the process? As the doors at the back of the cathedral swung open and Camille appeared, resplendent in her designer gown, Jamal felt a surge of panic. Time was running out. He had to do something, anything, to protect his father from the deceit that was about to become a legally binding contract. With a deep breath, Jamal made a decision that would change all of their lives forever. He stood up, his legs shaking, but his resolve firm. As all eyes turned to him in confusion, he opened his mouth to speak, praying that the truth would be enough to shatter the beautiful illusion Camille had so carefully constructed. What happened next would send shockwaves through the assembled guests and set in motion a chain of events that would expose long-buried secrets, test the bonds of family, and ultimately reveal the dark underbelly of New Orleans' glittering social scene. As Jamal's voice rang out in the hushed cathedral, the atmosphere shifted from joyous anticipation to shocked disbelief. The young boy's words, filled with fear and desperation, cut through the music and the murmur of the crowd like a knife. He spoke of overheard conversations, of sinister plans, of a woman who was not at all what she seemed. Marcus Johnson stood frozen at the altar, his face a mask of confusion and growing horror as he listened to his son's accusations. Camille, halfway down the aisle, had stopped in her tracks, her serene bridal mask slipping to reveal a flash of something dangerous in her eyes. The guests began to murmur, their shock giving way to a tide of whispers and speculation. Some defended Camille, dismissing Jamal's words as the jealous ramblings of a child unable to accept his father's new relationship. Others, however, began to recall small inconsistencies, odd behaviors they had noticed but dismissed over the past year. As the tension in the cathedral reached a fever pitch, Marcus finally found his voice. With a trembling hand, he reached for his phone, his fingers hovering over the keypad as he wrestled with the most difficult decision of his life. In that moment, looking into his son's pleading eyes and then at the woman he thought he knew, Marcus Johnson made a choice that would alter the course of all their lives. He dialed 911. The next few hours passed in a blur of flashing lights, stern-faced officers, and a cacophony of questions. The wedding guests were held at the cathedral, transformed from celebrants to potential witnesses in what was quickly becoming a high-profile investigation. Detective Andre Boudreau, a veteran of the New Orleans Police Department, took charge of the scene with a grim efficiency that spoke of years dealing with the city's dark underbelly. As Camille was taken in for questioning, her designer gown incongruous against the backdrop of police cruisers, the true depth of her deception began to unravel. Detective Boudreau's team uncovered a web of lies so intricate and far-reaching that it left even the most seasoned investigators stunned. Camille Dubois, it turned out, was not Camille Dubois at all. Her real name was Sophie Laurent, a woman with a history of fraud and confidence schemes stretching back over a decade. She had moved from city to city, leaving a trail of broken hearts and empty bank accounts in her wake. New Orleans was simply meant to be her biggest score yet. The art gallery she claimed to own was a clever front, laundering money from her previous cons while providing a veneer of legitimacy to her New Orleans persona. The charming, cultured woman Marcus had fallen in love with was a carefully crafted illusion, designed to ensnare a wealthy target and bleed him dry. But Sophie's plans had been more sinister than mere financial fraud. As the investigation deepened, evidence emerged of a complex plot involving falsified medical records, tampered medications, and a substantial life insurance policy taken out in Marcus's name. The woman who had promised to love him till death do them part had been planning to ensure that parting came sooner rather than later. For Marcus Johnson, the revelations were devastating. The man who had prided himself on his business acumen and judgment of character had been utterly deceived. As he sat in the police station, giving his statement in a voice hollow with shock and betrayal, he couldn't help but replay every moment of his relationship with Sophie Camille, seeing now the subtle manipulations and carefully planted lies. But amidst the pain and humiliation, there was one bright spot: his son Jamal. The boy's courage in speaking up, in trusting his instincts despite the risk of alienating his father, had quite literally saved Marcus's life. As the full scope of Sophie's plans came to light, Marcus felt a mix of profound gratitude towards his son and overwhelming guilt for having doubted him. The fallout from the aborted wedding and subsequent investigation sent shockwaves through New Orleans society. Friends and acquaintances who had been charmed by Camille now questioned their own judgment, wondering how they could have been so thoroughly fooled. The city's gossip mills worked overtime, dissecting every detail of the scandal with a mix of horror and fascination. For Jamal, the aftermath of his revelation brought a whirlwind of emotions. There was relief, of course, at having prevented a terrible tragedy. But there was also fear of the what-ifs, fear of the lingering danger Sophie's associates might pose, fear of how this event would change his relationship with his father. The boy who had shown such courage in the face of crisis now grappled with the weight of his actions and the uncertain future they had created. As the days turned into weeks, the Johnson family retreated from the public eye, seeking solace and healing away from the prying eyes of the media and their social circle. Marcus threw himself into cooperating with the investigation, determined to see Sophie brought to justice, not just for her crimes against him, but for all the others she had victimized over the years. Jamal, meanwhile, found himself thrust into a new role within the family dynamic. No longer just Marcus's son, he was now the protector, the one whose instincts and bravery had saved them from disaster. It was a heavy mantle for a 14-year-old to bear, and one that would shape the course of his life in ways he could not yet imagine. The story of the wedding that wasn't, of the boy who saved his father from a black widow's web, became the stuff of New Orleans legend. But for those at the heart of it, the true story was one of family, trust, and the unbreakable bond between a father and son that had weathered the greatest test imaginable. As the investigation into Sophie Laurent's crimes deepened, the true extent of her network began to emerge. Detective Boudreau and his team uncovered connections to organized crime syndicates operating throughout the southern United States. Sophie, it seemed, was not just a lone con artist, but a key player in a sophisticated criminal enterprise specializing in high-stakes fraud and exploitation. The revelation sent ripples of fear through New Orleans' upper echelons. How many other Sophie Laurents were out there, worming their way into wealthy families with nefarious intent? The city's elite began to look at each other with newfound suspicion, wondering who among them might be hiding similar secrets. For Marcus Johnson, the weeks following the aborted wedding were a brutal exercise in self-reflection and rebuilding. He threw himself into therapy, trying to understand how he had been so thoroughly deceived and determined to heal not just for himself, but for Jamal's sake as well. The guilt he felt for doubting his son's instincts ate at him, fueling many sleepless nights spent staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction with Sophie in his mind. Jamal, for his part, struggled with the aftermath of his actions in ways that surprised both him and those around him. While part of him felt immense relief and pride at having protected his father, another part grappled with a sense of loss. Despite everything, there had been moments when he had genuinely liked Camille, or the persona she had presented. The realization that those moments had been built on lies left him questioning his ability to trust his own judgment. The boy began to withdraw, spending more time alone in his room, his usual vibrant personality dimmed by the weight of recent events. His best friend, Tyler, tried to draw him out, but Jamal found it difficult to relate to his peers' everyday concerns in the wake of what he had experienced. How could he care about video game scores or school gossip when he had uncovered a plot that could have ended in his father's death? Recognizing the toll the ordeal was taking on his son, Marcus made the decision to temporarily relocate them both to their family's lake house in rural Louisiana. Away from the prying eyes of the media and the whispers of their social circle, father and son began the delicate process of reconnecting and healing. It was during these quiet weeks by the lake that Jamal finally opened up about the full extent of what he had overheard and observed in the months leading up to the wedding. He spoke of his fears, his doubts, and the crushing weight of responsibility he had felt. Marcus listened with a mix of horror and pride, marveling at his son's perceptiveness and strength of character. As Jamal's story unfolded, Marcus found himself seeing his son in a new light. The boy he had sometimes still thought of as his little man had shown a maturity and courage beyond his years. It was a bittersweet realization, tinged with regret for the innocence lost, but also filled with hope for the strong, principled man Jamal was becoming. Their conversations often stretched late into the night, sitting on the dock with their feet dangling in the cool water. They talked about Jamal's mother, about grief and healing, about trust and forgiveness. Slowly but surely, the bonds between them, strained by recent events, began to strengthen and deepen. As father and son worked through their emotional turmoil, the legal proceedings against Sophie Laurent and her associates moved forward at a steady pace. The case had caught the attention of federal authorities, with the FBI joining forces with local law enforcement to unravel the full scope of the criminal network. Sophie herself remained in custody, her attempts to charm her way out of trouble falling flat in the face of overwhelming evidence. As more victims of her past cons came forward, the picture that emerged was one of a ruthless, calculating woman who had left a trail of destruction in her wake. Back in New Orleans, the social fallout from the scandal continued to reverberate. Some of Marcus's business associates distanced themselves, wary of any connection to the high-profile case. Others, however, rallied around him, impressed by his handling of the situation and his dedication to seeing justice done. The media circus that had initially surrounded the case began to die down, but the story had captured the public's imagination. There was talk of book deals and movie rights, with producers seeing the potential for a thrilling true crime drama in the tale of the Black Widow bride and the boy who stopped her. For Jamal, the idea of his story being turned into entertainment was both exciting and deeply uncomfortable. On one hand, the teenager in him couldn't help but be thrilled at the idea of seeing his experiences on the big screen. On the other, he worried about being forever defined by this one event, about being seen as the boy who stopped the wedding rather than as Jamal Johnson, a complex individual with hopes and dreams of his own. As summer began to fade into autumn, Marcus and Jamal prepared to return to New Orleans. Their time at the lake had been healing, but they both knew they couldn't hide away forever. It was time to face the world again, to reclaim their lives and move forward. The New Orleans they returned to was subtly different from the one they had left. There were still whispers and sidelong glances, but there was also a sense of respect for how they had handled the crisis. Jamal's return to school was met with a mix of curiosity and admiration from his classmates, many of whom had followed the story closely over the summer. For Marcus, the return meant diving back into work with renewed focus and determination. The experience with Sophie had shaken his confidence, but it had also ignited a desire to use his resources and influence for good. He began exploring ways to support organizations that helped victims of fraud and domestic abuse, determined to turn his personal tragedy into a force for positive change in the community. As the weeks passed, life began to settle into a new normal for the Johnson family. Marcus threw himself into his work and philanthropic efforts, finding purpose in helping others who had been victimized by fraud. He became a vocal advocate for stricter background checks and financial transparency in relationships, sharing his story as a cautionary tale at conferences and seminars across the state. Jamal, meanwhile, found himself navigating the complexities of being a local hero. At school, he was treated with a mixture of awe and curiosity. Some of his classmates seemed to expect him to have all the answers now, to be somehow older and wiser than his years. Others, perhaps intimidated by his newfound notoriety, kept their distance. It was during this time, that Jamal found an unexpected ally in his English teacher, Miss Evelyn Thibodeau. A warm, perceptive woman in her late 50s, Miss Thibodeau recognized the struggle behind Jamal's quiet demeanor. She began to assign him books that dealt with themes of identity, courage, and the weight of responsibility, stories that resonated deeply with Jamal's experiences. Their discussions after class became a lifeline for Jamal, a space where he could explore his feelings without the pressure of being the hero everyone expected him to be. Miss Thibodeau encouraged him to write about his experiences, not for publication or praise, but as a way to process the whirlwind of emotions he had been suppressing. As autumn deepened into winter, the legal proceedings against Sophie Laurent and her associates reached a critical phase. The prosecution had built a strong case, bolstered by testimony from previous victims and a trail of damning financial evidence. Jamal, much to his trepidation, was called to testify about what he had overheard on that fateful night. The day of Jamal's testimony dawned cold and gray, a fitting backdrop for the somber proceedings. The courtroom was packed, with journalists and curious onlookers vying for a glimpse of the boy who had unraveled a criminal enterprise. Jamal felt the weight of their stares as he took the stand, his hands trembling slightly as he swore to tell the truth. As Jamal recounted what he had heard and observed, his voice grew stronger. He spoke of his initial doubts, his fear of ruining his father's happiness, and the gut-wrenching decision to speak up at the wedding. Throughout his testimony, he avoided looking at Sophie, focusing instead on the reassuring presence of his father in the front row. Sophie Laurent, for her part, maintained a mask of cool indifference throughout the proceedings. But those closest to her noticed the tightening of her jaw, the flash of anger in her eyes, as Jamal's testimony systematically dismantled the persona she had so carefully crafted. The cross-examination was brutal, with Sophie's defense team attempting to paint Jamal as a troubled teen, jealous of his father's new relationship. They questioned his memory, his motivations, even suggesting that he had fabricated the overheard conversation out of a desire for attention. But Jamal held firm, his responses measured and sincere. When asked why he had waited until the wedding day to come forward, his answer silenced the courtroom. "I was scared," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Scared that I was wrong, that I would hurt my dad for no reason. But I was more scared of what would happen if I was right and did nothing. I couldn't let her hurt him. I couldn't lose another parent." The impact of Jamal's testimony was profound. Even those who had doubted the boy's story found themselves moved by his evident sincerity and the courage it must have taken to stand up against such a formidable opponent. As Jamal stepped down from the witness stand, he felt a curious mix of exhaustion and relief. The weight he had been carrying for so long had finally been set down, his truth spoken for all to hear. The trial continued for several more days, with a parade of expert witnesses and previous victims painting a damning picture of Sophie Laurent's criminal career. When the jury finally returned with their verdict, there was a palpable tension in the courtroom. Guilty on all counts. The words rang out, bringing with them a complex wave of emotions for all involved. For Marcus, it was vindication tinged with lingering pain. For Jamal, it was the closing of a chapter that had defined so much of his young life. As Sophie was led away in handcuffs, her carefully constructed facade finally crumbling, Jamal felt an unexpected pang of pity. He wondered about the experiences that had shaped her into the person she had become, the choices that had led her down this destructive path. In the days following the verdict, the Johnson family once again found themselves at the center of a media storm. Requests for interviews poured in, along with renewed interest in turning their story into a book or movie. Marcus fielded most of these requests, determined to protect Jamal from any further intrusion into his life. As winter gave way to spring, a sense of renewal began to permeate the Johnson household. Marcus, inspired by his son's courage, decided to channel his energies into creating a foundation aimed at educating people about the warning signs of fraud and providing support to victims. He named it the Jamal Johnson Foundation for Truth and Justice, much to his son's embarrassed pride. Jamal, for his part, found himself drawn more and more to writing as a means of expression. The journal he had started at Miss Thibodeau's suggestion had grown into a detailed account of his experiences, raw and honest, in a way he couldn't be in his day-to-day life. With gentle encouragement from his teacher, he began to consider the possibility of shaping his writings into a book. Not a sensationalized account of the Black Widow case, but a thoughtful exploration of trust, family, and the weight of unasked-for heroism. As Jamal's 15th birthday approached, Marcus planned a small celebration, just family and a few close friends. It was a far cry from the lavish parties of previous years, but it felt right, a reflection of the new, stronger bond between father and son. The night before the birthday, Marcus knocked on Jamal's door, a small, wrapped package in his hands. Inside was a journal, bound in soft leather, with Jamal's initials embossed on the cover. "I know you've been writing a lot," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought you might like a special place for your thoughts." Jamal ran his fingers over the smooth leather, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. It represented so much more than just a journal. It was an acknowledgement of his growth, his voice, his truth. As they sat together on Jamal's bed, Marcus put his arm around his son's shoulders. "I am so proud of you," he said softly. "Not just for what you did, but for who you are. You're turning into an amazing young man, and I know your mom would be just as proud as I am." Jamal leaned into his father's embrace, feeling truly at peace for the first time in months. The road ahead was still uncertain, the effects of the Black Widow case still rippling through their lives. But in that moment, surrounded by the love and understanding of his father, Jamal knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. As spring bloomed into summer, the city of New Orleans seemed to exhale, shaking off the last lingering tensions of the Sophie Laurent scandal. Life moved on, as it always does. But the impact of those events continued to shape the lives of those involved in subtle yet profound ways. For Marcus Johnson, the experience had rekindled a sense of purpose that had been dormant since the death of his first wife. The Jamal Johnson Foundation for Truth and Justice quickly gained traction, attracting support from both local community leaders and national anti-fraud organizations. Marcus found himself traveling frequently, sharing his story and advocating for better protections against sophisticated scams. These travels often took him away from home for days at a time, a fact that initially caused some tension with Jamal. The boy, still processing the trauma of nearly losing his father, found himself anxious when Marcus was away. It took several heart-to-heart conversations and some family therapy sessions before they found a balance that worked for both of them. Jamal's own journey of healing and self-discovery continued to unfold in unexpected ways. His writing, once a private outlet for his turbulent emotions, began to attract attention beyond Miss Thibodeau's encouraging feedback. When a piece he wrote about the complexities of being hailed as a hero was published in the school literary magazine, it resonated deeply with readers, earning him a new level of respect from his peers. Encouraged by this success, Jamal began to explore other forms of creative expression. He took up photography, finding solace in capturing moments of beauty and truth in the world around him. His keen eye and unique perspective, shaped by his experiences, lent his photos a depth that belied his young age. As Jamal's confidence grew, so did his desire to use his voice to help others. He began volunteering at a local youth center, working with kids who had experienced trauma or family upheaval. His ability to connect with these children, to offer understanding without judgment, made him a valuable asset to the program. It was during one of these volunteer sessions that Jamal met Ava Beaumont, a social worker in her early 30s who specialized in helping children cope with family crises. Ava was immediately struck by Jamal's maturity and empathy, and she became a mentor figure to him, offering guidance and support as he navigated the complexities of his evolving role in the community. Ava's presence in their lives also had an unexpected effect on Marcus. For the first time since Sophie, he found himself drawn to someone, attracted not just to Ava's obvious beauty, but to her kindness, intelligence, and the gentle way she interacted with Jamal. However, the wounds from Sophie's betrayal were still fresh, making Marcus hesitant to pursue any romantic involvement. Jamal, with the perceptiveness that had become his hallmark, noticed the subtle dance between his father and Ava. Part of him was thrilled at the idea of his dad finding happiness again, but another part was wary, the echoes of Sophie's deception still lingering in his mind. As summer stretched on, the Johnson family fell into a new rhythm. Weekends were often spent at the lake house, a place that had become a sanctuary for both father and son. It was during one of these peaceful weekends that Jamal finally broached the subject of Ava with his father. They were sitting on the dock, fishing rods in hand, when Jamal gathered his courage. "Dad," he began hesitantly, "I've noticed how you look at Miss Beaumont. Do you like her?" Marcus was silent for a long moment, caught off guard by his son's directness. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, tinged with a mix of hope and fear. "I think I might," he admitted. "But after everything that happened with Sophie, I'm not sure I trust my own judgment anymore." Jamal nodded, understanding all too well the doubts his father was experiencing. "I get it, Dad, but Miss Beaumont isn't Sophie. She's kind and genuine. I've seen how she is with the kids at the center. You can't let what Sophie did stop you from being happy." Marcus looked at his son, marveling once again at the wisdom beyond his years. "When did you get so smart?" he asked, ruffling Jamal's hair affectionately. Jamal grinned, some of his usual mischievous spark returning to his eyes. "I've always been smart, old man. You're just finally noticing." As they laughed together, the tension broken, Marcus felt a weight lift from his shoulders. With Jamal's blessing, he decided to take a chance, to open his heart once again. The relationship between Marcus and Ava developed slowly, both of them aware of the need for caution and transparency. Ava, having worked with families affected by fraud and deception, understood the importance of building trust gradually. She made a point of including Jamal in many of their outings, ensuring that he never felt sidelined or forgotten. As autumn approached, bringing with it a new school year and new challenges, the Johnson family found themselves on more solid ground than they had been in a long time. The shadows of the past still lingered, but they no longer dominated every moment. Jamal, now entering his sophomore year of high school, faced the future with a mix of anticipation and trepidation. The notoriety from the Sophie Laurent case had faded somewhat, but he knew that the experience would always be a part of him. The challenge now was to move forward, to build an identity that incorporated his past experiences without being defined by them. On the eve of the new school year, Jamal sat at his desk, the leather-bound journal his father had given him open before him. As he began to write, his pen moved swiftly across the page, giving voice to his hopes and fears for the future. "Tomorrow starts a new chapter. I'm not the same person I was a year ago. None of us are. Sometimes I wonder who I would be if I hadn't overheard that conversation, if I hadn't spoken up at the wedding. Would I be happier? More carefree? Maybe, but I wouldn't trade the bond I have with Dad now for anything. I'm scared sometimes, worried that I'll never fully trust anyone again. But then I look at Dad and Miss Beaumont, at how they're building something real and honest, and I have hope. I have hope that there's more good than bad in the world, that love and truth can win out over lies and deception. I don't know what this year will bring. I don't know if I'll ever shake the label of the boy who stopped the wedding. But I do know this. I'm more than just that moment. I'm Jamal Johnson, son, student, writer, photographer, volunteer. I'm still figuring out who I am and who I want to be, and that's okay. That's the journey. Whatever comes next, I'm ready. We're ready. Together." As Jamal closed his journal, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead was uncertain, but he no longer feared the unknown. He had faced one of the greatest challenges imaginable and come out stronger. Whatever the future held, he would face it with the same courage and integrity that had seen him through the darkest days. Outside his window, the New Orleans night was alive with the sound of jazz floating on the warm breeze. It was the soundtrack of resilience, of life moving forward despite the odds. For Jamal Johnson, it was the sound of hope, of new beginnings, of a future bright with possibility. The story of the black boy who stopped his father's wedding and revealed a shocking truth about his fiancée had captured the public's imagination. But the real story, the story of family, trust, and the unbreakable bond between a father and son, was still being written. And Jamal Johnson, with pen in hand and determination in his heart, was ready to write the next chapter. As the new school year began, Jamal found himself navigating a changed social landscape. His role in the Sophie Laurent case had elevated his status among his peers, but it also created a barrier. Some classmates seemed intimidated by his experiences, unsure how to relate to someone who had been through such an ordeal. Others treated him with a sort of reverence that made Jamal deeply uncomfortable. It was during this time that Jamal's friendship with Tyler, his best friend since childhood, proved invaluable. Tyler had stood by him throughout the entire ordeal, offering support without judgment. Now, as they entered their sophomore year together, Tyler's unwavering friendship helped ground Jamal, reminding him that he was still just a regular teenager, despite everything that had happened. One crisp September morning, as Jamal and Tyler were walking to school, Tyler broached a subject that had been on his mind for weeks. "Hey Jay," he said, his tone casual but his eyes serious. "Have you thought about joining the school newspaper? I think you'd be great at it." Jamal considered the idea. He had been writing more and more, finding solace and clarity in putting his thoughts on paper. But the idea of sharing his writing with a wider audience was both thrilling and terrifying. "I don't know, Ty," he replied hesitantly. "What if people only want to hear about the Sophie thing? I'm trying to move past that." Tyler shook his head emphatically. "That's exactly why you should do it. You've got a unique perspective, man. You could write about stuff that really matters, help people understand what it's like to go through something like that. Plus," he added with a grin, "chicks dig writers." Jamal couldn't help but laugh at his friend's attempt to lighten the mood. "I'll think about it," he promised, grateful once again for Tyler's unwavering support. Later that day, Jamal found himself outside the office of Ms. Rosalie Doucet, the faculty advisor for the school newspaper. His heart pounded as he knocked on the door, but he took a deep breath, reminding himself that he had faced far more daunting challenges. Miss Doucet, a petite woman with bright eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, looked up from her desk as Jamal entered. "Jamal Johnson," she said, a note of surprise in her voice. "What can I do for you?" Jamal swallowed hard, then spoke. "I was wondering if there might be a place for me on the newspaper staff," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. Ms. Doucet studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, to Jamal's surprise, she smiled. "I was hoping you'd come by," she said. "We could use a voice like yours on the paper. But I want to be clear. If you join, you'll be expected to cover all sorts of stories, not just your personal experiences. Are you up for that?" Jamal felt a weight lift from his shoulders. This was exactly what he needed, a chance to use his voice, to be part of something bigger than his own story. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, a smile spreading across his face. "I'm definitely up for that." As Jamal left Ms. Doucet's office with a stack of paperwork and his first assignment, a feature on the school's new environmental initiative, he felt a sense of excitement he hadn't experienced in months. This was a new challenge, a chance to define himself beyond the events of the past year. Meanwhile, across town, Marcus Johnson was facing challenges of his own. The Jamal Johnson Foundation for Truth and Justice was growing rapidly, attracting attention from national media and potential donors. While Marcus was proud of the work they were doing, he sometimes felt overwhelmed by the responsibility. On this particular day, Marcus found himself in a meeting with potential investors, outlining the foundation's plans for a national awareness campaign about romance scams and financial fraud. As he spoke, he could feel the weight of their scrutiny, knew they were weighing not just his words, but his very character. Mr. Johnson, one of the investors, a stern-faced woman named Barbara Clements, interjected, "Your personal experience lends credibility to this cause, no doubt. But how can you assure us that your judgment won't be clouded by your emotions? How do we know you're the right person to lead this initiative?" Marcus felt a familiar twinge of self-doubt, the echoes of Sophie's deception threatening to undermine his confidence. But then he thought of Jamal, of the courage his son had shown in the face of uncertainty. Drawing strength from that memory, Marcus met Barbara's gaze steadily. "Miss Clements," he began, his voice firm, "my experience doesn't cloud my judgment. It clarifies it. I've seen firsthand the devastating impact of these crimes, not just on the victims, but on their families and communities. That's why I'm committed to approaching this work with both passion and professionalism. We have a team of experts in law enforcement, psychology, and finance, advising us at every step. My role is to be the voice of the victims, to ensure that their perspectives are never lost in the data and statistics. As Marcus continued, outlining the Foundation's comprehensive approach to education and victim support, he could see the investors' skepticism giving way to interest and then enthusiasm. By the end of the meeting, they had secured the funding for their national campaign, with Barbara Clements herself volunteering to serve on the Foundation's advisory board. As Marcus left the meeting, feeling a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration, his phone buzzed with a text from Jamal. "Got a spot on the school newspaper. Can't wait to tell you all about it." Marcus felt a surge of pride and love for his son. Despite everything they had been through, Jamal was moving forward, embracing new challenges. It reminded Marcus that healing wasn't just about overcoming the past. It was about building a new future. That evening, the Johnson household was filled with a sense of celebration. Marcus ordered Jamal's favorite pizza, and they sat around the kitchen table, Jamal excitedly sharing his plans for his first newspaper article, while Marcus recounted the success of his investor meeting. As they talked and laughed, both father and son were acutely aware of how far they had come. The shadows of the past year still lingered, but they no longer dominated every moment. There was light breaking through, the promise of new beginnings and second chances. Later that night, as Jamal sat at his desk working on his article, he found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. He opened his journal and began to write. "A year ago, I thought I knew what my life was going to be like. I had it all mapped out, high school, college, maybe law school like Dad. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. The Sophie Laurent case changed everything. For a while, I thought it had broken us, broken me. But now I'm starting to see that it also made us stronger. Dad and I, we understand each other in a way we never did before. We've learned the hard way that trust is precious, that the truth matters more than anything. I'm not the same person I was before all this happened. I'm more cautious, yeah, but I'm also more aware. I see things I never noticed before. And now, with this spot on the newspaper, I have a chance to use that awareness to make a difference. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if I'll ever fully shake the label of the boy who stopped the wedding. But I do know this. I'm more than just that moment. I'm Jamal Johnson, son, student, writer, truth teller, and I'm just getting started." As Jamal closed his journal, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he no longer feared the unknown. He had faced one of the greatest challenges imaginable and come out stronger. Whatever the future held, he would face it with the same courage and integrity that had seen him through the darkest days. Outside his window, the New Orleans night was alive with the sound of jazz floating on the warm breeze. It was the soundtrack of resilience, of life moving forward despite the odds. For Jamal Johnson, it was the sound of hope, of new beginnings, of a future bright with possibility. The story of the black boy who stopped his father's wedding and revealed a shocking truth about his fiancée had captured the public's imagination. But the real story, the story of family, trust, and the unbreakable bond between a father and son, was still being written. And Jamal Johnson, with pen in hand and determination in his heart, was ready to write the next chapter.